It's a distinct pleasure to participate in this activity. Been following Tales of Cape Cod for some time and glad to finally be able to add my tale to it. And would particularly like to thank Nancy and Paul Thompson for sponsoring my presentation. And I would also like to acknowledge a former board of directors, Vanessa Mendes, who had actually first brought my work to the board to be considered about 3 years ago. So glad to see it came to fruition through that combined effort. And that combined effort is one of the sub-themes of what I wanted to talk about this evening, the New England Thruway. I guess I would have to start the story, as a storyteller, I would have to start the story going back before my existence with my mother and my grandparents, who first came to the Cape in the late 1950s. They actually had got, my mother and my grandmother in particular used to like to do a lot of travels, a lot of trips in the summertime. And during a trip to Martha's Vineyard, saw the Cape from the ferry and decided, you know, we should check that out next. Now, they had made arrangements. They were going to stay at a hotel. And my grandmother, understanding, now remember, we're talking about the 1950s, having traveled a bit, my grandmother understood that traveling north of New York wasn't really that much different than traveling south of New York or south of DC even. So she decided to call ahead and wanted to find out if this was going to be a place that would be welcoming, in fact, to a Black family. And because, to quote my grandmother, I'm going on vacation, I'm not out to integrate any place. And that level of consciousness, like I said, kind of runs through the family. So she called the establishment, and they said that they themselves did not have a problem, but they could not account for the behavior that some of the guests might exhibit. So they made a suggestion of a couple of other places that were not only welcoming to Black families, but were actually Black owned. Now, the Cape was, and to some extent remains, a segregated place. And very much like the areas, again, when you get to the South, you did have places that provided vacation homes. So some of the places that my grandmother and mother became aware of were the cottages owned by Ms. Eugenia Forts. Now, the cottages owned by Ms. Eugenia Forts, of course, hold a place in history because these were cottages where people like Adam Clayton Powell, for example, stayed. In fact, I believe he wrote a lot of the briefs from the Brown versus the Board of Education. A lot of the brief was typed while he was on vacation in Hyannis at one of her cottages. Her cottages were also utilized by Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King as a vacation space. So that was a well-known one. Another set of cottages were in Osterville, owned by the Gomes family, now owned by Joseph Diggs, but his grandparents were in fact the ones who first had these cottages, as well as Joe's Twin Villa, which also played a role. The villa itself played a role in some of my early experiences as a musician on Cape Cod. And then, of course, in Mashpee, you had this was a true multi-enterprise because you had a spot called the Wigwam. The Wigwam was a hotel and motel with cottages that also had a barber shop, a breakfast diner, a bar, and also a straight up dinner restaurant, all housed within this one place owned by a gentleman named Edward Mitchell. And so these were and also there were a set of cottages in Mashpee. There were a pair of cottages that were owned by a lady named Teresa Johnson. And these were the accommodations between Mashpee and Barnstable that were available at the time, or I should say welcoming at the time to Black and brown people who wanted to come to the Cape for vacation. So this is how my family became acquainted with the Gomeses and the Diggs. by renting a cottage, renting one of the cottages there in Osterville. And of course, got to know people. And the social life for, again, Black and brown people at the time, you had a number. Now, in these days, it's very interesting because you had a number of Black-owned venues and Black-owned and brown-owned restaurants and places around the Cape. You had Zach's, you had Slade's, which is connected, of course, to the Slade's in Boston. You had Maddox's. I had mentioned the Wigwam, but you had a variety of venues and places. You had Joe's Twin Villa, and then in Mashpee you had Joe Pete's, which was also one of the welcoming venues. And so coming to stay in Osterville, getting to know people in Osterville, getting to know the Gomes family, this is how my family came to find, or at least my mother's side of the family came to find out about Mashpee, because that was one of the places you could go. And, getting back to the notion of business and Black-owned business, again, it's going to be a running theme in what I'm talking about. The space that I'm sitting in right now is actually my recording studio. Just opened this summer. I know it's odd to open a recording studio during a pandemic, but we've been operating anyway. Polyphonic Studio is the facility that I opened, and it's in keeping with the tradition of opening and maintaining our own businesses. And as a musician and as a record producer who utilized a number of studios and wonderful studios on the Cape, that are not in operation anymore, I saw it as necessary to open a facility that could serve the purpose that places such as REO Studios in Centerville and MDI serve for the local musician, local production company, but also just the entire construct of entrepreneurship. We're going back to the entrepreneurship of people like Eugenia Forts, the Gomes family, the Mitchells and Mills who have the Wigwam, and Ms. Johnson. These became the venues that my family would become familiar with because of the fact that these were the places you could go and be comfortable. And that's, how my mother came to discover the town of Mashpee. I won't say discover the town of Mashpee, but how the town of Mashpee, I should say, came to her consciousness. Now, the decision, one thing I should also mention is that being West Indian, one of the traits that you will find is that West Indians buy land. They build businesses, but they also buy land. We don't rent, we buy. So after visiting the Cape and renting cottages, the decision was we should buy some land probably and build a summer home, because the Cape started to become a rather regular destination. Well, in looking for pieces of land, one of the people that my mother came upon was a woman named Clara Dixon. Clara Dixon owned land all around Mashpee. There were a lot of people who owned empty land around Mashpee. Bear in mind, Mashpee now one of the fastest growing cities, as they call it, in Massachusetts, which I believe now has about close to 13,000, 14,000 people. At the time, probably had a little under 2,000 people living there in the entire area. So there was a lot of land. Land was fairly inexpensive. Well, one of the people who owned a lot of land was Clara Dixon. She was put in touch with my mom, and of course showed my mother some of the property that she had for sale, but also mentioned that she had a son who lived in New York who was working at the time for Campbell's, which was Campbell's, Pepperidge Farm, and Swanson, were all the same company at the time. Well, the son called up my mother, and anyway, to make a long story short, those are my parents. Clara Dixon, my grandmother. Clara Dixon was married to Stephen A. Peters. Stephen A. Peters, my grandfather, at the time was deceased, but my grandfather had been a selectman in the town of Mashpee. But even another little interesting piece, he was the selectman who actually was the first Wampanoag to win, or actually the first person running for selectman, period, in the town of Mashpee to win on the Democratic ticket. He was part of the pre-Franklin Roosevelt wave of Democrats in the town of Mashpee, but he was the first one, because before that, people of color by and large voted Republican. Mashpee was no different. And but he was the first of the Democrats, and of course this was part of the grassroots movement to start switching folks over, the average person, over to the Democratic Party, which was one of the pushes, or the pushes before Roosevelt even ran. This was a plan, but tied into this plan, again, Stephen Peters was a selectman in the town. He was actually the person who brought electricity into most of the town of Mashpee, and it was said that he brought electricity into the town of Mashpee because my grandmother refused to stay there without electricity. She had grown up in Boston, and of course, coming to the Cape was a bit of a, at the time, especially because it was a very, very, very rural community, was a bit of culture shock, I would say, probably for her. But, so my mother and my grandparents bought some property. They did not buy property from Clara Dixon, my grandmother, but they did buy property from a gentleman, Mr. Barrows, who also happened to be West Indian, who owned a tract of property off of Great Neck Road, around Asher's Path and between Lowell Road and so forth. So bought a parcel of land, and eventually built a house, which became our family's summer home in Mashpee. Now, my mother was a psychiatric social worker for the New York City Board of Education. So the wonderful thing was her work year was basically the school year, and she got the summer off, just like most people who worked for the Board of Ed at the time, or I would say most of the teaching and professional staff did. So what that resulted in, by that point, my parents had divorced, but my mother and grandparents still had their home in Mashpee. So what that meant was that every summer of my life, I was born in 1968, June of 1968, every summer of my life was spent in Mashpee. The home, by the way, wasn't finished until I was just before I turned 2. So before that, it was rental. It was basically rental cottages and visits in Mashpee. But by the time I was 2, and you're fully aware, I knew that summertime, it was interesting because as soon as June would come, it was like a Pavlovian type of thing. I realized, we're going to Mashpee, we're going to go to Mashpee, we're going to go to Mashpee, which was, again, a different experience because you're living in an urban environment. I lived in Co-op City and enjoyed Co-op, but enjoyed the Cape more. I was more into the rural kind of scene and, the certain level of independence that you're allowed, because Mashpee was also, not being the city, a safer environment. So you could wander, you could explore, you could do things, and not to mention that when you went outside, you didn't have to wait for an elevator before you actually got outside. So that was a wonderful thing. But one of the, I would say, bits of culture shock that took place was as I started to get older and realized, now, I again backtrack. In the Bronx, I lived in an area known as Co-op City, a development, very large development. If you've ever driven into New York City on I-95, once you get to about exit 13, the beginning of the city limits just after New Rochelle, you see these large buildings off to the left. Those large buildings, that's Co-op City, and it really was a city. You could go from pre-K to 12th grade, do your grocery shopping, had all sorts of amenities, and never actually have to leave Co-op City. In fact, a lot of people, that was a similarity. You had some people who never left Co-op and never had to leave Co-op, just like you have some people who live on the Cape and never cross the bridge and don't see a reason to. We had people who lived in Co-op and never really saw much of a reason to have to go outside of Co-op. But Co-op was also a very, very, very diverse community, and I have to say both diverse and a community, because it was a number of people, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different walks of life. We had people who, Eastern European folk, you had Asian people, you had the various people of the African diaspora, you had African Americans, you had West Indians, you had people actually from the continent of Africa, you had various people of the Latina communities, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, etc. And we were all living in the same area, and we were all each other's neighbors. And it was a really interesting and rich experience. Well, what I began to realize was that level of diversity and interaction that I got used to in New York City was rather different than the experience that I would have on Cape Cod. Case in point, I remember when I was 6, I went to visit Camp Good News. It was a day camp not too far outside of Mashpee. And age of 6, Sandwich, Cape Cod, was the first time and first place I got called a nigger. Did not happen in New York City, happened right here on the Cape. Now, I do have to say, in the spirit of progress, I got called a nigger at the age of 6. My son didn't get called a nigger till he was 12, so I guess that's an improvement. Something to, something to think about. But in terms of the childhood memories, going to the pond was a wonderful thing. If I came up in the spring, getting to go to the herring run, and that's where my father taught me how to catch herring. That was a beautiful experience. Being able to ride bikes down dirt roads endlessly all summer with my friends, that was a beautiful thing about Cape Cod. And, again, the safety factor. You could go down these dirt roads, didn't have problems, didn't have to worry about things, predators, etc. It was, it was a very different community. And of course, the interesting thing was, in Mashpee, I was related to virtually everybody in my childhood, the tribe. So therefore, everybody was cuz. And somewhere along the line, everybody was your relative. And of course, now you began to get an expansion of people from the outside. Now, here again, we start to get another change, because as they start to develop South Mashpee, you get developers who came in, acquired land, bought land, and in a number of cases stole land. One of the legendary people who stole a lot of land had earned the nickname Chicken George, because he used to build chicken coops on land and then claim adverse possession and start paying taxes on it. And that was how he acquired people's land, and then, of course, developed it, turned it over. Well, these developments in South Mashpee started pulling people who, it was very interesting, because Mashpee was always considered the brown town, the town where you had Wampanoags, you had Black folks living where people had their summer homes, etc. And now the brown town had a number of people who were coming from places like Quincy, South Boston, Weymouth, and so forth, who weren't exactly, how should I say, didn't really like Black and brown people, but for some reason moved to the Black and brown town because of the fact that land was plentiful, land at that point was inexpensive. So they came in, but then there was a resentment of the existing population. And as this started to take place, this is where we now have the land suit of 1975-76, where the tribe starts to sue for the return of tribal land, which had become town land because of an act that took place in 1870, which turned Mashpee into a town. And of course, when it turned it into a town, still most of the land was owned by Wampanoag families, but the level of sophistication, when you own land, you felt you own land and you own the land. But in terms of the level of sophistication around taxes and taxation, that wasn't always present. So people weren't always paying taxes, and of course, people weren't always being reminded to pay taxes. So you had people who came in and were able to take the land because of non-payment of taxes and because they understood things about when you don't pay taxes on land, your land is up for grabs, and whoever pays the taxes on your land now owns your land. So then people would come in and pay taxes and back taxes on land, and now they own the land. Well, that's how that happened. That's how a lot of that happened. And when it was recognized by some of our elders, including my uncle, Russell Peters, this is where the land suit takes place. Now, in the story of the land suit in Mashpee, let's go back to the Bronx. The year is, it's now the fall of 1976. And of course, the land suit is in full swing and everybody's up in arms. And by the way, one of the interesting things that happened as a backlash of the land suit was a sort of like out and out attack when I talk about black and brown businesses, there was basically sort of like an attack on black and brown businesses, which included my father's business. At the time, my father owned a fuel oil company, you know, heating fuel that people use, Peter's Fuel Oil. And what he began to find happening was, because of the land suit, he had a number of people in South Mashpee who had been loyal customers who decided they weren't going to buy oil from a Wampanoag, or they weren't going to buy oil from a black man. So he lost a considerable number of the customers that he developed over a couple of years as a result of this. But now another little interesting piece with the land issue. As I said, we're now the fall of 1976. I'm in 3rd grade. Now, the other thing that happened in that time period, 1976, was the introduction of the miniseries Roots, the televised version of Alex Haley's novel. And my 3rd grade teacher, you know, everybody now all of a sudden had Tracy Roots fever, so my 3rd grade teacher being of no exception, Mrs. Piquet was her name. Mrs. Piquet had us interview our parents. Now, first we were supposed to write a story about our mother's side of the family. So I wrote my story about my mother's side of the family. Everybody came from Barbados, landed, first started out when they got to this country in Harlem, and which is kind of unusual because usually when you're West Indian, you go to New York, you end up in Brooklyn. In fact, if you think about it, the borough of Brooklyn, I think, has more West Indians than the West Indies itself has when you really look at it, but I digress. But anyway, they first were in Harlem and then moved to the Bronx. And I'm in 3rd grade and I write about my mother's family, West Indians, you know, no issue. But then I write about my father's family. And of course, with my father's family, I'm writing about Mashpee, and I'm writing about Wampanoags, and I'm talking about, I have an uncle who's a supreme medicine man, and I have another uncle who has sort of started and is in charge of our tribal council, and hand this in. Well, a few days later was open school night. And during open school night, Miss Piquet decides to tell my mother that I have serious mental problems and that I live in a dream world. My mother is trying to figure out, again, my mother's a psychiatric social worker trying to figure out, well, what is she seeing that I might have missed? And Miss Piquet then produces my essay on Mashpee and talks about, I made up some fictional town called Mashpee. Now, what we have to remember is, when you went into restaurants on the Cape, one of the popular placemats was a map of Cape Cod, and it would have the different towns on it. These maps rarely ever even marked off Mashpee. You would have Falmouth, and then the next town mentioned would be Barnstable. But Mashpee didn't even make these maps. So nobody knew anything about Mashpee. Nobody knew Mashpee existed. Mashpee, like I said, didn't even appear on maps. It wasn't, you know, if it was referenced by the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, it would be a picture of, and, you know, they used the same picture for years, but it would be a picture of some Indians in regalia in front of the meeting house. But other than that, Mashpee wasn't considered, Mashpee wasn't known, wasn't talked about. So as far as Miss Piquet was concerned, I had made this whole thing up, this town called Mashpee and these Indians called Wampanoags. You know, you really think it's funny when you think about Thanksgiving every year and what a big deal they make about Thanksgiving, and these are school teachers and they don't even know the name of the nation that the Pilgrims encountered. So I made up Mashpee, and I made up these Wampanoags, and I made up this uncle who's a medicine man, and I made up this uncle who's a tribe. And, you know, maybe I decided I was watching some old Western movies and decided that would be, well, that's how I would concoct this story. Well, my mother tells Mrs. Piquet, all of this is true. And the look that Mrs. Piquet gave my mother was one of, oh, now I see where his problem, now I see what his problem is, and now I see where he gets it from. Now, I didn't know anything about this conversation that took place. What I know was I wrote this essay. I know that my mother went to open school night, and I know that the day after open school night, my grandfather pulls out this book that my Aunt Amelia Bingham had written about the town of Mashpee and said, you know, you should show this to your teacher. I think she'd be interested in reading this. Oh yeah, okay, cool. So I take the book into school and I give it to Miss Piquet, and not realizing why her reaction is the way that it is. It's sort of like a 1-2 punch, because here is this book about a town called Mashpee, and in the book about the town of Mashpee is this medicine man named John Slow Turtle Peters, and councilman named Russell Peters, et cetera, et cetera. So realizing, and of course, there was also a town report, and at the time my father was a selectman, so he's in the town report. So now Mrs. Piquet is realized, has to eat crow, but of course Mrs. Piquet was a little too arrogant to do that. But now here's the 1-2 punch. The land suit becomes national news thanks to Walter Cronkite. So there we are, CBS News with Walter Cronkite talking about, and he introduced the term Wampanoag. So here we are watching this thing with Wampanoags, and of course, as he goes on looking at this town of Mashpee, this fictional town of Mashpee, on the camera come all of these people named Peters, including this medicine man named John Peters, and including this tribal council leader named Russell Peters. So 1-2 punch to Miss Piquet. And the land suit was a saving grace that I didn't even know about, because no one told me about Miss Piquet's reaction until I was probably later on in high school. But that's some of the back and forth between the Bronx and Mashpee. Now, one of the things I cover, I guess I have to do it, novel that I have that just came out called Land of the Black Squirrels. I talk a little bit about the, in the introduction, I talk a little bit about the mix of traditions that's experienced. And of course, the interesting thing is when you live in some place like the Bronx that has that much diversity, the fact that you're coming with a different culture is not an unusual thing. And it just sort of mixes in with what's already there. But this is from the prologue of the novel, Land of the Black Squirrels. Like any tradition placed in a cosmopolitan setting, the elements of other traditions that we're directly exposed to can and will have their influences. West Indians, particularly folks from Barbados, and First Nation indigenous, particularly from Mashpee, are the family storytelling traditions that I grew up immersed in, along with some community influences from the storytelling of Black folks originating from the South, Eastern Europeans, Sicilians, Irish, and, well, a symbolic case in point, while I learned how to fish for herring at the Mashpee River from my father, it was behind Building 5 in Co-op City that an elderly Eastern European gentleman taught me how to fillet them for pickling. On the other hand, Wampanoags, which are the native nation of eastern Massachusetts, under which the Mashpee tribe is organized, cure herring in smokehouses. A common aspect of our worlds, we are people of oral traditions, with stories that live in words, both spoken and sung. Sometimes our songs can tell stories without lyrics, be it the lighthearted bounce of the clarinet in Eastern European clemser, or the melancholy flow of a tenor sax in bebop jazz, or the bird in a tree near a river sound of a native flute. A story is being told. So you see, in terms of the storytelling tradition and the tie and the lines, you think about, as I explained to my students, when we tell stories and when we experience the world, we do it with our senses. And in fact, we have 7 senses. They always talk about 5 senses, but we have to remember that intuition, which people refer to as the 6th sense, is a sense. And reason, which is a sense that humans have, don't always exercise, but humans have, we actually have 7 senses. And when we experience the world, we're experiencing the world with these 7 senses. Well, as you get older and become more aware of your surroundings, you begin to recognize interesting things about the experiences that you're having. And as I got older, began to recognize some of the very interesting things and experiences about Cape Cod and Mashpee. Now, one thing that always puzzled me was if the Mashpee Wampanoag were here first, or the Wampanoag in general were here first, because of course you had Nauset, you had various tribes, Mashpee being one of those that survived, at least in this area. you learn different interesting traditions like where towns and streets get names. You find out that people of naming things after what they've quote unquote conquered. So therefore, you have things like Wampanoag Drive, Iano Road, the same way that they would name a street Oak Street or Elm Street or Pine Street, because there used to be it's in honor of the oak tree that they knocked down to build that street, or it's in honor of the elms that they ripped down to build that street, what have you. So I guess when they name a street Wampanoag Drive or Iano Road, it's in honor of the Indian they see it as they knocked down. But then there also comes the ongoing denial of a person's identity, because of course part of the fight in the land suit was actually what could be described as racialist tactics by saying, oh, well, they're not really Wampanoags anymore. They might have had Wampanoag ancestors, but they're not Wampanoags. And it's really, really quite interesting to see what I refer to as flipped eugenics. When I say flipped eugenics, it's because of the fact that Wampanoags, for some reason, we're not allowed to change or evolve. We have to somehow stay exactly the way we were 500 years ago to prove exactly who we are. Now, one of the funny things that I want to share with folks, if you look at the dashiki that I'm wearing, this is actually one of my favorite dashikis. And the reason why it's a favorite dashiki, I bought it from one of the South American vendors at Mashpee Powwow. So it's the dashiki that I always say, oh yeah, I love this dashiki because I got it at the Mashpee Powwow. And of course, sometimes people want to have a fit about that, but that is where I got it. But for me, I saw it as symbolic of, we have maintained traditions, we have maintained culture. It's very obvious. We have many people in the tribe, especially we have a generation now growing up in the tribe that actually speaks the Wampanoag language. We have one of our elders, Jesse Baird, who reintroduced the language so that we would have access to it. We have maintained traditions. We still fish. We still hunt. We have the various traditions, but of course, clothing, hairstyles, etc., can change. Exposures can change. Access to things can change. But it becomes, I realize, in line with when Toni Morrison talks about the factors of distraction used as a tool of racism, that becomes the distraction, because what happens is now you have people trying to constantly say, oh, you're a Wampanoag, prove it. Prove you're a Wampanoag. Prove you're a Wampanoag. Now, I don't hear people running around saying, you're an Irishman? Prove you're an Irishman. Prove you're an Irishman. Dance a jig. Thatch your roof. That kind of thing. But this is the kind of ridiculous thing that we're subjected to on a regular basis. Yes, I have regalia. Yes, I have danced in powwow. I haven't danced in a while because I got bad knees, but I've danced in powwow. And still at the same time have participated in drum circles and bembes. I love being able to go, once upon a time I could go a couple of blocks away when I lived in the Bronx, but now I love the fact My apologies. We have a little bit of an internet issue with this building, and unfortunately, it decided to happen right about now. But I'm back. Anyway, as I was saying, the various, let me readjust. All right. As I was saying, the various culinary aspects and social traditions of both heritages that I grew up in are things that I grew up immersed in, and I still very much celebrate to this day, and it's still part of the things that I even teach and pass on to students. And of course, here we are in the present, where I'm actually 3 years shy of being a tribal elder. And of course, in the other part of my community, basically already being an elder, passing the information on, and working and mentoring and teaching with young people. But the New England Thruway proved to be also a saving grace, because one of the things that I found when I reached adulthood, after I finished college, I moved and finished college and finished grad school, living in Boston for all that time. I moved back to Mashpee and found that the professional landscape for people of color was very shaky on Cape Cod. So therefore, often finding you'd have to go off Cape for employment. As a teacher, I taught while I was living in Mashpee, taught in Boston for several years. In terms of theater, I was very fortunate to be under the tutelage of the late James Spruill, who was a professor of theater at Boston University, and his wife, Linda Patton, who was a well-known playwright at the time. And they had a theater company, New African Company, which is the oldest continuous professional Black theater company in New England. But having had training from them and wonderful training from them, there was still the issue of when you do theater on Cape Cod for people of color, there's not really much out there. I do have to give a serious shout out, by the way, to Nina Schussler, Harwich Junior Theater, and the various programs they have there, because that was one of the few theater companies where people of all hues could actually go and do theater and get some work. But if I wanted to do theater, I would have to do it in Boston, or I would have to do it in Rhode Island or someplace else, because there really weren't opportunities like that. And of course, as a musician, the same sort of thing. I found that little gigs here and there. And again, have to give all due respect to Joe Diggs, who at the time was the owner and manager of Joe's Twin Villa in Osterville, because that was one of the venues where you could get a gig. And there was another place where you could play called the Prodigal Son Coffee House in Hyannis. But outside of that, found myself gigging out on the road. And of course, being on the road, that was where I-95 came right back into the picture, because I'm doing now gigs in New York, I'm doing gigs in Connecticut, I'm playing gigs in, not really much in Jersey, but playing gigs down in Washington, DC. DC and U Street became a really active place for me. When I'm doing studio session work up in Boston, playing with the guys from Berkeley, and finding that Cape Cod is where you live, and when you're a person of color, it's a place where you can live, but when it comes to professional respect, very, very, very different kind of landscape going on here. I found, in fact, I remember being told by one theater company that I'd put a resume into. This was even without any kind of audition or anything. The artistic director was being rather, I should say, I would say was trying to talk me out of doing theater. And I remember getting off the phone with him and just finding that to be a very, very odd conversation, a very, very discouraging tone. And then the next call that comes almost immediately after his, the year, by the way, is 2000, getting a phone call from Lincoln Center inviting me to come down and work. And when I went to New York in 2000 to participate at the Lincoln Center Theater Lab, that's when I find that, wow, there's good work down here, and gee, I guess Cape Cod must have much higher standards than Broadway, because I can't work with the theaters on Cape Cod, but now all of a sudden I'm working with Lincoln Center. I'm working with the Harlem Theater Company. I'm working with the National Black Theater Company. I'm working with the New Federal Theater with Woody King. I'm working also with the New Yorican Poets Cafe with Miguel Algarin, and all of this in New York City. And I'm finding that now my plays that Cape Cod, oh, that's cute, ha, 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 ha. Now all of a sudden my plays are getting produced around New York, and then out of New York, colleges are picking up on my plays, theater companies around the country, theater companies in Canada, theater companies in the Caribbean and in the UK are picking up on plays that Cape Cod would not touch. So I began, so what you find with that kind of situation is a certain level of validation. Either Cape Cod has standards that are higher than professional theater in the rest of the world, or there's just something wrong with the way some people think about the way they do things out here. So these become some of the adult experiences. And of course, one of the other adult experiences as a male of color that I should bring up is the joy of driving on Cape Cod and dealing with law enforcement. And of course, sometimes at night, having to drive through towns like Brewster and having to drive through, I never really had much of a problem in Harwich, but having to drive through towns like Brewster and Sandwich and Orleans and Chatham, and having interesting experiences with law enforcement. Never getting arrested, never even getting a ticket or anything like that. And of course, looking at what's going on with so many of the things that you're now seeing on social media, I can proudly say, I lived through many of these, lived through all of these experiences, and see how many people weren't so lucky, especially, also looking 1988, what happened with David Hendricks in Mashpee, and his situation being similar to so many of the other situations that I see, but that becomes part of the reality of being a person of color on Cape Cod, that you, again, was not really experiencing this other places. But the funny thing is, as difficult as that becomes, this is still home. This is where, the street that I live on is the street that my grandparents lived on, which is the street that my great-grandparents lived on. The street that I'm raising my son on is the street that my father was raised on. So it's home. And you're not really gonna run from home, even when you're dealing with the difficulties and the difficult situations like that. But recognizing that I-95, for somebody who wants to do something, becomes part and parcel of your lifeblood. Now, again, when I mentioned I taught in Boston, I taught in New York City, and had a really weird teaching gig on the Cape, and such a strange teaching gig that I didn't want to teach public school on the Cape anymore. But here again, being discouraged as an educator, but at the same time, after living in New York for 3 years as a playwright, in fact, while I was in New York from 2000 to 2003, I can probably say that I was the only musician in New York who had theater as a day job, because as I'm working in all the various theaters, I'm also now working as a producer for a couple of companies. One was a sub-label called Melodic Syndrome, and Melodic Syndrome was a sub-label under Sony. I had a contract with them, and I'm doing different things. I'm also running the house band in a club down in Greenwich Village. I'm finding that I-95, like I said, becomes lifeblood, because Mashpee is still home, but still had to do all these things. But then 2003, I was at that point going through the degree lessons of becoming a Freemason under Prince Hall Masonic Lodge in New Bedford, which turned out was also my grandfather's lodge, Stephen Peters Lodge, Union Lodge number 4. One of my brothers calls me up and says, there's a job here at UMass Dartmouth with your name on it. So dropped a resume, didn't think about it. Next thing I know, a few months later, I get called in for an interview, get the job, and I'm back home. So I'm living in Mashpee, but of course, as a professional, have to go over the bridge. So I teach at UMass Dartmouth. But to me, Mashpee is home. Mashpee will always be home. And of course, there's an indelible factor about New York City where I haven't really, except for the period when I went back to New York, lived in New York for years. The majority of my time has been in Massachusetts, but I'm still very much a New Yorker and still very much from the Bronx, land of the black squirrels. I guess I will end it there.
Thank you, Morgan, very much. We have one question. Has the situation for job opportunities changed on the Cape in 2020?
I would like to think so, but evidence suggests it has not. When I look at the situation that young teachers of color are experiencing on Cape Cod and seeing that they're hitting the same walls that I hit 20 years ago, and I would say, however, what people are embracing, which is a beautiful thing, you can't get a job, start a business. And I'm seeing a lot more businesses spring up out of the communities of color. And as I said, I'm right now sitting in my business.
Let's see if there's any more questions. If there's any more, people can you chat into, or we will end the session in a few minutes. Anyway, Malam, I want to thank you very much. Very enlightening. As somebody who came from the city myself, moving to Westchester, I found some of the same things you did. Even though I wasn't a Black American, I was an Italian American and still faced some of those same issues. But
well, I mean, remembering the part of the Bronx I grew up in, right alongside many wonderful folks from the Sicilian communities, and yes, they experienced a lot of the same issues we did.
And I had relatives who lived in Co-op City, so I'm very familiar with it. I've been there, and I know what it's like. You're right; it's very diverse, and I think it's good for children to grow up in that environment and not be isolated. I think they get along better. But anyway, thank you so much for your presentation tonight, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. And with that,
thank you
I will wish everybody a good night.